The hand that pushed Joseph toward Egypt was not the hand of an enemy. It was the hand of a brother. That is why betrayal cuts so deeply. It does not only wound the present, it reaches backward and makes you question what you thought was safe. You replay the moment. You search your memory for the sign you missed. You wonder how someone close enough to know your heart could still choose to harm it. And beneath the grief, another question begins to rise. Where was God when they chose to do this? Joseph's story begins near that question, not with a throne, not with honor, not with an explanation. It begins with brothers, a pit, a coat stripped from his shoulders, and a road into Egypt he never chose. Years later, Joseph would name the evil without pretending it was harmless, but he would also discover this. Evil had written a chapter, but it had not been given the final sentence. This is not a story about revenge, and it is not a guarantee that every wound will make sense in this life. It is a story about providence in the place where trust was broken. The betrayal was real, but it was not ultimate. Betrayal is not only what happened, it is what happened afterward. It is the way one person's choice keeps echoing through rooms they no longer have to enter. They may have moved on, but you were left to rebuild around damage you did not choose. You became careful with your words, careful with your trust, careful even in places where you used to feel safe. That is why betrayal can divide a life into before and after. Before you knew they could do that. After you had to live with what they did. And sometimes the wound becomes spiritual. If God was watching, why did he allow this? If God is good, why did the road forward begin with something so wrong? Joseph's life does not answer those questions from a safe distance. It answers them from the pit, from a foreign house, from a prison, from years when the story had not yet explained itself. His story does not minimize evil. It does not ask the wounded person to call betrayal good. It does not rush grief into a lesson before grief has been named. Joseph's story begins in darkness, and for a long time he has to walk without seeing how God will use what others meant for harm. Joseph enters the story in a family already marked by tension. Genesis shows us a household where love, favoritism, jealousy, and resentment are tangled together. Joseph is loved by his father. His brothers hate him, and that hatred does not stay hidden. In Genesis 37, Joseph is sent to check on his brothers. He goes looking for them. But when they see him coming, their hatred becomes a conversation, then a decision, then a sin they cannot undo. They strip him of the coat that marked him as favored by his father. They put him into a pit. Then Joseph is taken down the road to Egypt. With that one act, his life is torn away from everything familiar. His home, his father, his place in the family, his sense of safety, the life he had known. The pit is not only a dramatic scene, it is the place where betrayal becomes visible. The hands that put Joseph there were not foreign hands. They were family. They did not merely dislike him, they removed him. They sent him into a future he never agreed to enter. For someone who has been betrayed, that matters, because betrayal often feels like being pushed into a life by someone else's decision. Joseph did not climb into the pit by ambition. He did not walk into slavery by strategy. He did not plan a path to Egypt. From the human side, his story was violently redirected by other people's sin. And yet the Bible does not allow that sin to become the final meaning of Joseph's life. That is where the story begins to ask a deeper question. Can God still speak over a life after other people have tried to give it a different ending? The betrayal of Joseph does not end when he leaves the pit. That is one of the painful truths of the story. Sometimes betrayal is painful not only because of what happened, it is painful because of where it sends you. Joseph is taken down to Egypt. He becomes a servant in the house of Potiphar. Genesis does not pause to describe every ache of exile, but the distance tells us enough. Joseph was no longer home. And yet Genesis says that the Lord was with Joseph. That sentence is important, but we must hear it carefully. The Lord being with Joseph did not mean Joseph was immediately removed from suffering. It did not mean the road became easy. It did not mean the consequences of betrayal disappeared. God's presence was real. But Joseph was still in Egypt. Then the wound deepens. The second wound came after he did the right thing. Joseph is falsely accused. He suffers not because he became corrupt in Egypt, but after resisting sin. If we were writing the story, this would be the moment where faithfulness should be rewarded. Joseph keeps his integrity when no one from home is there to see it. And the reward, at least at first, is not freedom. It is prison. Sometimes obedience does not open into relief. Sometimes it leads into a room where faith has no audience. First the pit, then slavery, then false accusation, then prison. If we read too quickly, we rush to the end because we know Joseph will eventually stand before Pharaoh. But Joseph did not live the story knowing the end. He did not wake up in prison already holding the final chapter. He had to live one day at a time. He had to do the next faithful thing while no one could tell him when the door would open. And even after helping another prisoner, he would be forgotten. That detail matters. Because the wound was not only betrayal, it was betrayal followed by silence, faithfulness followed by prison, hope followed by waiting. That is where many people lose heart, not only in the first wound, but in the years when nothing seems to explain it. Joseph teaches us that God's presence does not always mean instant escape. Sometimes, God is with a person in the very place they would never have chosen. Not only when he is lifted up, not only when he can finally see the purpose, the Lord was with him in the hidden years. And if God was with Joseph there, then hidden years are not proof that God has left. The deeper question in Joseph's story is not only, why did his brothers betray him? It is this: can God still speak over a life after other people have tried to give it a different ending? That is the question betrayal leaves behind. Because betrayal does not only create pain, it creates interpretation. It tells you what to believe about people. It tells you what to believe about yourself. And sometimes, in the quietest place of the heart, it begins to tell you what to believe about God. Maybe God did not see. Maybe God did not care. Maybe the hands that harmed me were stronger than the hand that held me. Joseph's story does not answer that fear by pretending the evil was small. His brothers did evil. Genesis does not excuse it. Joseph does not erase it. And God's providence does not make cruelty innocent. That distinction matters, because wounded people are often hurt again by careless spiritual words. Someone may say, "It had to happen," or "God needed them to betray you," or "You should be thankful they hurt you." But Joseph's story is more careful than that. It does not ask us to call evil good. It shows us that God can remain sovereign without making evil innocent. They meant harm. That meaning was real. But it was not the only meaning in the room. Joseph could not see the deeper meaning at first. He could not read the final chapter from the bottom of the pit. He could not understand preservation while walking into slavery. He could not see famine while sitting in prison. And that may be one of the hardest parts of faith after betrayal. You are asked to keep breathing before you understand. You are asked to keep walking before the road explains itself. But Joseph's life tells us this: the evil done to you may become part of your history, but it does not have the authority to become your name. The wound may speak loudly, but it is not Lord. The betrayal may have changed the road, but it does not sit above God. The word that holds Joseph's story together is providence. But providence is rarely visible while the wound is fresh. Joseph could not see Genesis 50 from Genesis 37. He could not know, in prison, that famine was coming. He could not know that God would one day use his suffering to preserve many lives. That matters, because wounded people are often pressured to interpret their pain too quickly. Find the lesson, find the purpose, move on, forgive, testify. But Joseph's story does not move that fast. The clarity came after years, and even when clarity came, it did not erase the evil. Eventually, Joseph is raised to authority in Egypt. Through God's wisdom, many lives are preserved during famine, and then his brothers come before him. The men who once used power against him now stand before him with none. This could have become a revenge story. Joseph had power, he had memory, he had the wound. But at the end of the long road, Joseph gives the story its clearest sentence. Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. That sentence holds two truths together. They meant evil. God meant good. Human intention was real. Divine providence was deeper. If we lose the first truth, we become dishonest about evil. If we lose the second truth, we surrender the story to evil. Joseph does not say, "You did not hurt me." He does not say, "It was nothing." He does not say, "Your sin was secretly righteous." He says, "You meant evil." That is honesty. Then he says, "But God meant it unto good." That is providence. Christian hope does not erase either sentence. It lets both stand and waits for God to be greater than the wound. The brothers had one meaning for their actions. They wanted Joseph out of sight. But God was working with a meaning they could not see, a meaning Joseph could not see at first either. This does not make the pit less dark. It does not make slavery less unjust. It does not make prison less painful. It does not make the years less costly. But it does mean the story was never only in the hands of the betrayers. What they meant for evil was real, but it was not ultimate. Maybe you are still close to the pit. Maybe the betrayal is not old enough to feel like a testimony. Maybe it still feels like a wound that wakes up before you do. If so, Joseph's story does not ask you to explain everything tonight. It does not ask you to call the wound good. It does not ask you to protect the person who harmed you from the truth. And it does not ask you to rebuild trust where there has been no repentance, no honesty, and no safety. Joseph named the evil. That matters. Faith does not require denial. But Joseph also refused to let evil stand where only God belongs. That matters too. Because betrayal often pulls the heart in two directions. One direction is denial. Denial says, "It did not matter." It rushes past grief. It uses spiritual language to bury what still needs to be brought into the light. The other direction is bitterness. Bitterness says, "This is all I am now." It keeps the betrayer at the center. It allows their sin to keep speaking long after the moment has passed. Joseph shows another way. He does not pretend, and he does not surrender. He tells the truth about what they meant. Then he tells the truth about God. For the wounded heart, Healing may begin there, not as a sudden feeling, not as instant forgiveness, not as reconciliation with unsafe people, but as one quiet act of surrender. Lord, do not let their sin become the center of my name. That prayer may not feel strong. It may come through anger. It may come through tears. It may sound less like victory and more like a person trying to breathe again. But it is still faith. It is the wounded heart placing the road back before God. You may not understand the whole road. Joseph did not understand it from the pit. You may not see what God is doing. Joseph did not see it in the prison. But the hidden years are not proof that God has left. And the evil done to you does not have the authority to name you. So begin quietly. Tell the truth. Name the evil. Do not call it good. And do not let the face of the betrayer fill the whole frame. Return for a moment to Joseph in the pit. There is no throne there, no explanation, no visible purpose, only darkness beneath him and betrayal above him. Maybe that is where you are, not at the end of the story, not where everything makes sense, only in the part you never chose. You do not have to call the pit good. Joseph never had to call evil righteous in order to trust God. But you also do not have to give the people who wounded you the right to name your whole life. Their choice may have changed the road, but they are not the Lord of the road. The pit was real, but it was not sovereign. The betrayal was real, but it was not ultimate. And the God who was with Joseph in the hidden years is not absent from yours. So do not rush tonight. Let the truth settle quietly. The wound was real, but it is not strong enough to hold the pen forever. The pit was not the end of Joseph's story, and what wounded you does not have to become the name you answer to.